Welcome back to Nuances, Our Asian Stories. Today's episode is special. It's going to be a little bit different than our usual. Back in season 1 in 2022, we talked to Cece Chow, an Asian trans woman from Canada. She shared her struggles with transition, how it affected the dynamics within her own extended family and with her friends, and how she lost elder male privilege she enjoyed since birth and experienced misogyny for the first time, and how it's often hard for non Asian queers to understand the extent of her grief when it comes to losing her extended family. There have been 16 anti trans bills that have passed in the US in 2024 so far. In Alberta, Canada, the state where Cece is from, a recent policy change banned puberty blockers, hormonal treatment, and gender-confirming surgery for children under 15. Extreme right conservatives claim that these laws are to protect children, but as you'll hear in this episode, these could actually really harm trans kids, and they already are. With all this happening, I felt it was time for another chat with Cece because I know that if more people knew the struggles that Cece and other trans folks go through, they would have so much more compassion for the trans community. Because we can't really empathize if we don't know the struggle, and we can't know the struggle unless we hear it from trans folks firsthand. A few days ago, a new report from GLAAD and the watch group Media Matters for America showed that 66% of New York Times stories about anti-trans legislation failed to include trans voices. So if you don't have any trans person in your life, it's likely that you've never truly thought about or understood what it's like to be in their shoes because you've never heard that perspective before. I hope this episode gives you a better understanding of what trans people go through and why gender-affirming care is potentially a matter of life or death for those kids. And if you're a parent or loved one of a trans person and you're struggling to understand them, I hope this episode will show you how wholesome trans stories can be. Because I promise you, this is super wholesome. It is so sweet, it'll make you want to cry. Since our last conversation, Cece has continued to use her voice to speak up against anti-trans bigotry. She also has had gender-confirming surgery, and one of her kids also came out as trans. While there are still daily struggles, Cece finally feels at home in her body. So if you are trans, I hope this episode helps you feel seen, feel less alone, and hopeful for the future. If you'd like to revisit our 2022 conversation, I will link to it in the show notes. Trigger warning, this episode does mention suicidal ideation and sexual assault, so if that's not for you, it's okay. You can come back when you're ready. Now, if you turn on conservative-leaning channels these days, you might hear people talking about trans right activists as if they're used car dealers trying to convince more kids to buy the trans trend. They make it seem as if parents are forcing their kids to have medical procedures and making kids believe they're trans when they're not, and that is simply fear-mongering. The truth is, trans kids feel their gender dysphoria whether or not the rest of the world acknowledges that or not, and whether or not the rest of the world helps them or not. Here's what Cece had to say when I asked her what it was like for her as a kid and when she knew she was trans.
As a kid, I started struggling with my gender without understanding that it was gender that I was struggling with. It started like in grade 4 or 5 with the clothes I was wearing and not wanting to wear certain boys' clothes and wanting to wear some of the stuff that the girls got to wear. It didn't really get bad until I got into puberty, developing facial hair, the way that my voice dropped. It was really hard seeing my own body develop the way the boys' bodies around me were developing rather than the way that the girls' bodies were developing. And as a result, it was very difficult for me to connect with the boys. And yet at the same time, although emotionally I connected really well with the girls and it was easy to make friends, I was always just a bit on the outside because I didn't look like them and I wasn't experiencing puberty the way that they were experiencing. And so they saw me as a boy. And so I had to hang out with the boys, yet not fitting in. So I ended up having a very lonely childhood.
So at the time, were you even aware of the concept of transgender or did you not know anything about it?
So I was born in the late 70s, but grew up in the 80s. There was no representation. I didn't know that it was a thing. I really didn't know until university. When I was in university, we saw the beginning of the internet. And suddenly there was all of this information available on bulletin boards and stuff like that. But it still didn't feel like a thing that I could claim. There was no positive representation for it. There was a lot of negative representation eventually in media and movies. And so I ended up not transitioning until much, much later in life, until I was 42. And by that time, I had married a beautiful woman, had kids with her, 2 kids. Yeah, it was very, very challenging, and I think a lot of what I was feeling was like because what I could see in media was drag queens and, I don't know, Rocky Horror Picture Show, which was definitely not me, and, like, drag queens aren't trans necessarily. I couldn't see myself, like, that wasn't me, and, what we saw in the media wasn't me, and I wasn't like the villains who were portrayed as trans in the movies. So it was like, "Oh, that can't be me."
So when Cece was a kid, she didn't know what was happening to her. She just knew that she felt uncomfortable and she tried to play the role that was assigned to her as a boy, as a son. What I want people to notice here is that people like Cece know that they're trans without necessarily knowing the term trans. People who have gender dysphoria experience it whether or not they have the ability to put it into words or not. In the next section, we talk about when Cece finally hit that breaking point where she decided to transition. When was the switch for you where you decided that you wanted to transition, where you realized that you wanted to transition and present as feminine?
I had my gender epiphany to understand myself as trans, to accept myself as trans. One day in the shower, I was applying soap and just I had a complete panic attack at cleaning myself and being like, "Oh, there's a penis attached to my body and this feels so wrong." And it's not that I didn't feel that wrongness before, but it was never so intense that I would have a panic attack. And that was six years ago. That was the beginning of a very difficult time. And there's been a lot of deconstruction of identity and discovery of identity.
This gender epiphany happened when Cece was 42. So I asked her when she started taking her first step after that epiphany, not really expecting the answer that she gave me. Even before she had acknowledged to herself that she is a trans woman, she had been taking those little steps that made her feel more comfortable in her own body. Here's what she had to say when I asked her about her first steps transitioning. And it started way before that epiphany at 42.
I like to say that I've been in transition for years and years and years because starting in university, I went through this phase where I grew my hair out. I blew dry my hair with a round brush. I taught myself how to do a blowout, and I did that every day. At first, it was this little short bob, and it got longer, like sort of shoulder length. And that was something that was gender affirming. I used to cycle a lot, and so I shaved my legs because I had this excuse of, "Oh, I'm a cyclist, I shave my legs." But really, it felt more affirming to my gender. I felt more comfortable in my body that way. There were other things like I groomed my brows. They were skinnier than they are now. That was all while masculine presenting. But like since my gender epiphany, I think it took me 3 months because I was like, I need to come out to my closest friends. I need to come out to my now ex wife, my brother, my parents, and then my children. And then I would start my social transition. And so it was about 3 months after my epiphany. And I remember going to the store and I was like, okay, I'm gonna buy some more feminine pants. And like I did everything really gradually in a stepwise fashion. And so I bought new pants and I had like 3 pairs of girl pants and proceeded to rotate through the 3 pairs over and over and over and over again. and then slowly switched over to women's blouses, which were, button ups. So it was really gradual for me, very like sort of subtle. And I taught myself how to do makeup at night before washing my face at night. I started with mascara, and when I got comfortable with mascara, I don't know, I think I started filling in my brows, and I just kind of added things one step at a time, and it was really gradual. So I didn't go on a big shopping spree and get all the makeup and like try to apply all the makeup at once. Like there is this trope of newly out trans girls are like teenage girls who want all the makeup and they want to do all this stuff, and then they end up, a little clowny because they're still learning. Which is, cis girls go through this, and like trans girls can go through this, but I like systems. And so I like kind of
Yeah.
added to it once I got more comfortable and better.
As someone who's cisgender, meaning that I feel like the gender that was assigned to me at birth, I can't imagine what it would be like if I were to be told by society that I should act like a man when I feel like a woman inside. And I cannot imagine what it must be like to finally be allowed to present the way that you feel. And so I asked Cece what it was like wearing those girl pants for the first time. Again, the answer surprised me a little bit. I expected some joy and relief and positive things, but there was also still doubt, still feelings of discomfort about the parts that she thought were too masculine. So it's a constant struggle between what she's seeing and what she wants to see in the mirror. When you bought those first pairs of pants and you wore them for the first time, did you feel different than when you were wearing the guy pants?
It did feel different. It was like this clothing was meant for me. This makeup is meant for me. It was like a bridge to an experience of living that I'd never had and that I'd always
Yeah.
dreamed of.
When you and I met, you had transitioned socially. How did that feel to you to be seeing yourself feminine and wearing the clothes that you want, wearing the makeup that you want, and being accepted that way?
There was a lot of imposter syndrome. And I guess in addition to the imposter syndrome, there is body dysmorphia, which is when a person looks at themselves, they don't see reality. They see this alternate version of reality in their minds. I reached this point where I was considered by people as pretty, but I couldn't see myself as pretty. And so there was a lot of just pretending that I saw myself that way because other people were saying it, and it's really challenging. It's taken quite a long time to reconcile the image in my brain with what is actually physically happening to my body. And so like even now, I can look in the mirror, and at times I will recognize a feature from before my transition, and the gut feeling is, oh, that's so masculine, even though a lot of traits like facial structure or bone structure or whatever is, they're not inherently masculine or feminine. Like if we really take a look at all of the people out there, there are lots of beautiful women who have broader shoulders than I have, and who, I don't know, have a more prominent brow bone. And I'm talking about cis women, but when I saw those things in myself, I was like, "Ooh, it was so masculine." But I think it's because that was attached to the old feelings of myself. It's almost a little like CPTSD in that sense. It's like a flashback. So I have the
Yeah.
feelings from before, because I recognize it now. But I'm slowly making progress in reconciling that the things that I see aren't always actually the things that I see with
Yeah.
my eyes, and taking a view of, well, let's look at the women in my life. Oh, this is my friend. And wow, I think that she's beautiful, but her shoulders are broader than mine. I mean, that specifically happened to me, but that's been very helpful in rewiring my brain a little bit.
Yeah.
And I think that that's not necessarily even a trans challenge. The body image challenge is not just a trans one.
Going back to anti trans legislation that has been passing in the US and Canada and other places that are trying to limit children's access to care, a lot of people have very strong opinions about it. And as I said before, a lot of the headlines covering those legislations are not including any trans voices. So I wanted to ask Cece what having access to gender affirming care meant to her. And here's how Cece described how painful her gender dysphoria was and why it was so essential for her to have access to that care.
For me, transition was a life or death situation. I often hesitate to call it a choice because, given the choice between living and dying, I think most people will choose whatever it is they have to do to live. I've struggled with suicidal ideation linked to my gender dysphoria. Transition really was the thing that saved my life. I gave a talk on Trans Day of Remembrance about how I went through a lot of my life, not self harming by cutting or with drugs or whatever, but I constantly put myself into dangerous situations. So it's sports situations, mountain biking, snowboarding, rock climbing. And I would take all the risks because I don't know, it didn't quite matter if I lived or died because I couldn't, how to say this, because society told me that who I am is not acceptable, told me that I cannot be who I am. You have to be this man and father and husband. Transition and medical care and intervention really saved my life. When you hate your body, you're not going to take care of it. You're going to be sacrificing, like, sorry. Um, I wasn't planning on getting emotional. Um,
It's okay. Take your time.
when you hate yourself, it's very hard to want to live. And transitioning and getting on hormones and eventually getting my vaginoplasty are are things that saved my life. They were things that helped me be able to live in my body in a way that felt authentic and natural, even though the process was hard. With my hormone therapy, I was on androgen blockers to block testosterone, and then estradiol and progesterone to feminize. And I'm very lucky that my body has feminized really quickly and in a way that feels good to me. And so I had breast growth and I lost a lot of muscle mass and I got curvy. I got a bum. My butt used to be pretty flat despite being an athlete. With those things came more comfort in my body and it it made me care. It made me care about me, and it made me care more about the people around me. It made me care more about like my children, and it made me care about the world and all the things that were happening in it. It made me care about my city, and then finally getting my vaginoplasty in Montreal, Quebec, about a year ago that has been so life changing. Like, I've had a pretty trauma filled life, and I was experiencing so much dysphoria from living in a body with a penis attached to it that there was no space to process those traumas. I could not heal from them because I didn't have a mental capacity and emotional capacity to do that. And then in this last year after my vaginoplasty and finding relief from that gender dysphoria finally allowed me to process things like getting raped and, sexual assault as a child and even stuff like corporal punishment from my parents when I was a kid and like processing through those things It just wasn't possible before finding a home in my body because everything felt so wrong all the time.
Being able to transition made Cece care about herself, about the people around her, about her city, about the world, and everything happening in it. And it also allowed her to finally heal from traumas that she was just unable to process because of all her gender dysphoria before. When I spoke to Cece's son, Gideon, I asked him if he thought Cece changed after her transition. Here's what he had to say. You said that other than changing her gender, that didn't really change her as a person. She's still the same person. But did you maybe notice that she was happier, more at ease?
Yeah, actually, kind of. In in what she would call the before times, she would help me study. I used to be a bad bad student. I would not want to study it. It's the stereotypical Asian where the kid is just like, no, I don't want to do this. I don't want to sit at the dinner table and do whatever homework I got given. Before, it was a lot like I was upset, and then she was also upset because my teachers were sending emails about how I'm not doing any work or my marks are really bad. And so she was also really upset. And we were just both upset at each other. But then afterwards, it became, well, first, I became a better student, but she would still help me. And it became more of a discussion, like a discussion about the work. Why is it that you can't bring yourself to do this kind of work? Or what's going on in class that's like you're getting these low marks? And then we work on that first before just doing whatever homework, or we worked on the underlying issues before just doing whatever homework I had or studying.
So not only did she care more, but she was able to show up differently. I asked Cece about surgery, whether she spent a lot of time weighing the pros and cons, the risks involved, and what that whole process was like for her. Here's what she had to say.
I think the pros and cons was really was really easy. I knew right away, when I had my epiphany in the shower, I knew that I want to have a vaginoplasty. And at that point, I already knew what the operation entailed. Like I had done all of the research and kind of knew that the surgeon that I would be seeing would be in Montreal because that's where my provincial health district sends everybody. I already knew all the things that would happen. I mean, there were things that I didn't know that I found out later. But like the pros and cons, like the con was there could be complications, like, oh, you might have hair in your vaginal canal. Typically recovery is 3 months of just about all bed rest and doing post surgical care. I guess those were the cons, but the pro was if I get this, I think I won't die. And so getting to live despite whatever complications came out of the surgery kind of outweighs all of the cons. And it's like, even if I die from the complications, at least I would have fought for me.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so it wasn't a hard choice for me. And I know for some people it is. It is a hard choice and it can be really heavy. But I'm also the person who, as a young adult who rode their bicycle a lot, was like, if I had an accident on my bicycle that somehow amputated my penis, I'd be pretty okay with that. I've always known, always,
Yeah.
in quotes. Yeah.
There is a lot of commentary and poorly informed media coverage of potentially nefarious effects of gender affirming care for children. Yet they completely overlook the opportunity cost of not providing that care, which is self harm. If your child is so uncomfortable in their skin that they'd consider self harm, would you not do everything in your power to help them as a parent? One of the conservative talking points I often hear about is, well, what if they regret transitioning later on in life? I asked Cece what she thought about that. What do you say to people when they tell you kids shouldn't have access to it because they might regret it someday?
I think the thing that often isn't looked at is, are kids going to regret not having that care? Because I can tell you that every late in life trans adult will tell you, I wish I could have gotten this care when I was a child. I wish I could have delayed my puberty so that I didn't grow facial hair. Like I had electrolysis to remove my facial hair, and I could have bought a car with the money that I spent on that. And that's not a thing that's covered by insurance or whatever that's out of pocket, right? Just the masculinizing of the body in terms of a trans feminine person. Those are irreversible changes too, right? If your bones grow a certain way, they are just going to be that way. And like brow bones on testosterone influenced growth tend to be more pronounced and stick out more. And those are permanent things, right? Like you can get cosmetic surgery. Yeah, sure. It costs a lot of money, right? So that's one side of things. It's like by not providing the care, you are still causing irreversible changes that can't be, like, you can compensate for them after the fact. But, like, the amount of money and time and risk involved in those corrective procedures it's far greater than puberty blockers that
Yeah.
delay puberty, and then it just resumes and they're like, oh, but it's gonna harm their growth or whatever. And it's like, okay, so even if, and it's not an actual talking point, right, but like even if they're a little bit smaller, like they're not as tall as their peers or whatever, is that really such a terrible thing if you are giving a child the chance to grow up with the childhood that they deserve, right? Like for me, I went through this childhood where I couldn't connect with my friends who were girls. I was always on the outskirts. I didn't get to go to the mall with them. I didn't get to go shopping with them. I didn't get to learn how to put on makeup with them. I don't get those experiences. I didn't get to have my true sexual awakening and puberty with my peers because I went through a puberty that just didn't feel right. It didn't really didn't work for me. And then now going through my second puberty with hormones and then third puberty with my vaginoplasty, my age peers don't even remember what it was like. They don't remember puberty anymore. And so it's like I grew up alone in childhood, and
Yeah.
then now in my second and third puberty, I am doing it alone again. And it's not to say that there isn't community, but it's not the same as growing up with it as a child, as a teen and a young adult.
As you can see, it's not just about them feeling insecure and not comfortable in their body, but it's also them missing out on their childhood, missing out on connecting with kids of the same gender who identify as the same gender. It's robbing them of formative experiences that they could otherwise have if they were allowed to be themselves. When it comes to potentially life-changing decisions that may cause irreversible changes to your body, there's a lot of things that we allow kids to do. For example, if a child wants plastic surgery and the parents agree, there's no law against that. If a teenager, tween, gets pregnant, we allow her to do that. In fact, in some states, we're even forcing her to have that baby, even though it might be very dangerous for her. We allow kids to play football quite competitively, and football players often have concussions. We also allow teenagers to sign up to join the military and go fight wars in distant countries and potentially be disabled or killed at war. That's a life-changing decision, and yet we're not banning military recruiters from going to school and marketing that, are we? But that said, being a parent is hard. with so much conflicting information out there, I can totally understand that parents would be anxious if they have trans kids. So I asked Cece what advice she would have for parents who have trans kids and aren't sure what to do and whether to allow their kids to get gender affirming care.
I myself am a parent to a trans kid. So my youngest came out to me about a year and a half ago as non-binary. And they were 12 at the time. And, I was able to say all the stuff that I wished my parents would have said to me. But do I worry about them? I I do. And I think honestly, I think it isn't any different than any other thing that you would do to care for your child. In the sense that, like, for my youngest, they are now 13. They are coming into the onset of puberty. They're a little bit of a late bloomer, which is perhaps a blessing. But to me, I'm like, oh, puberty is coming. So I had to have this talk with them. Normally, like 13, people are like, oh, I gotta have this birds and the bees conversation with my kids and I don't know, premarital sex and safe sex and whatever and STDs and whatever. But with my youngest, I'm like, look, puberty's coming. Do you understand what changes are coming for your body? And you've seen your older brother. I'm like, are you okay with your body changing in those ways? And so we had this whole conversation about puberty. And then, for them at that, like when we had the conversation to be like, I think it might be okay. And sometimes we don't know that it's not okay until we're in it. And suddenly it's like, oh, this is not okay. But having the conversation means that if it becomes not okay, then we can choose to do something about it. Well, I don't have to wait until they go through all the way through puberty. Oh, they can just like hit the beginning and they're like, I'm freaking out about this. And we can put that on hold. Right. And when it really comes down to it, is what are the ways that you care about and care for your child as a person? Not what you want, but what is actually best for them. The statistics on self harm and suicide for trans kids, they're frightening. As a person who's struggled with suicidality my entire life because of my gender incongruence, I don't want any child to go through that, especially not my own child. I think we need to approach it. And I'm going to steal something from the last episode of season 3 of your podcast where your guest was like, we need to approach it with compassion for people. Let's not indoctrinate. Let's
Yeah.
actually have real conversations with our children and trust that they know what they feel without indoctrinating them. And like that's for the parents. I think the flip side is that a lot of the conversation around puberty blockers and like cross-sex hormones for the purposes of transition, it doesn't actually come from a place of care. It comes from a place of control. And when we can understand that all the anti-trans legislation is about control of our bodies, control of trans bodies, the thing that we need to realize is that that's not where it ends. They are doing this because the people in power, their power comes from oppression. So to maintain control, they need somebody to oppress. And it isn't limited to trans people. It isn't limited to queer people. Like, that's where it starts. That's where it started with Hitler also. And so it starts with trans people and then queer people and then people of color. Although, I mean, arguably people of color are still being oppressed, but it's going to be all people of color. Like the model minority myth, that's not even going to exist anymore. Like it's going to be all people of color. And then they're going to come for reproductive rights. They're going to be policing all women's bodies, which they all do already. And even all the stuff we have about banning trans women in women's sports, that's about controlling women's bodies. It isn't about controlling trans women's bodies. It's about controlling all women's bodies. And so, for anybody who isn't a cisgender, hetero, white dude, they just haven't gotten to yet. Right. And so, not let them, let's not let them
Yeah.
do that. When we fight for the rights of the most marginalized, we guarantee the right for all the rest.
Now, this is the part where it gets really wholesome. If you made it this far into this episode, I'm sure you're the kind of person who wants to be the best supporter of your trans friends and loved ones as you possibly can. And I can think of no better models for that than Cece's family. We'll also hear from one of Cece's kids who shared how he experienced her transition. This is how Cece's ex-wife reacted to Cece coming out.
The first thing out of her mouth was, "Oh my God, this is going to be so hard for you. How are you going to get through it?" So the first thing out of her mouth was concern for me and centered around my wellness over her own. She's just been so supportive. I mean, she went through emotions around it, heartbreak and anger and, disappointment, all the things that you would expect when going through loss. But the one thing that we promised each other was that we were going to make it as easy as possible for the children, who were super amazing. When I came out to my eldest, he was like, "Okay, but you're a girl who likes cars? I don't understand." And I was like, "Well, there's girl race car drivers and drift car drivers and stuff. They obviously like cars, right?" And he was like, "Well, yeah, okay." And that was it. My youngest is just the most empathetic person. And after I came out and asked if they had any questions, they were like, I struggle with things too, but it's okay to feel that way. And then he gave me a big hug. And like that was kind of it. Like that it wasn't a big deal for them. And having that support meant that even if I lose all the rest of my family, I still have my family. My ex-wife and I, we still have a lot of love for one another. And it took us a while to redefine the relationship and figure things out and set boundaries and things like that. But we're still family. We have a lot of love. We're just not lovers anymore. And I lost just about all of my extended family, with the exception of a few people. In Chinese culture, family is everything. And I was prepared to lose everything, but in the end, I didn't have to lose. I didn't have to lose all of it.
I had the opportunity to talk to Cece's son Gideon about what the transition was like from his perspective. Next week, I will be publishing the full interview with him where we talk about not just Cece, but also his life as a high schooler. But I wanted to share with you a snippet of our conversation about what the transition was like for him. Was it a shock to you when she came out, or?
It was surprising, but I remember one thing she said was that she still likes cars, she still likes video games, she still likes all these other things. Nothing's changing about that. We're still going to be able to play games together or work on cars. So I think that lessened it a lot for me. It wasn't something that I really had to struggle with. I think the way that she came out was very easy for me to interpret, especially being just way younger.
We often see parents talk about their child coming out to them, but rarely the other way around. So I'm really interested to hear what that was like for you, for a parent to come out. You have had the unique experience of starting out with a mom and a dad,
Yeah.
and now having two moms.
Yeah.
Two amazing moms.
Yeah.
Sounds like. Is it really different?
Not really. right?
Yeah.
Especially in my position. I mean, she's still the same person, so she still has her own core interests. It's not like she unlearned things. I guess a really good example would be like well, not every season, but most seasons, we change tires together on cars. I don't know. It's a traditionally masculine thing. You teach your son to change the tires, change the oil filter, whatever. But like, it still happened, and I still like I know how, and there's not really as big of a difference as you would think.
Yeah.
It's not really like a change in parenting or whatever. It's like it's still the same person, really.
I asked Gideon if he knew anything about the trans experience, and here's what he had to say.
It's like dragons, like they exist, but like, have you ever really seen one? Like thinking back, like I probably definitely have. It's just I never.
Never really thought about it much.
I know I'm a kid. I'm not looking
Yeah.
right to like not notice the struggles that might be there. In my mind before, it was you identify as this, and that's okay. But I never really took into account how that would affect someone's relationships or their interactions with other people. When she came out, I had kind of the same mindset of like, okay, well, that's this now. It's not like I didn't care. It was like, wow, that's a huge step. But I didn't see or really understand the consequence until like a few months in when I noticed people are like, oh, they're treating her differently, or like, oh, this kind of messed up.
Even though they all supported Cece, I'm sure this was not an easy time. So I asked Gideon how he coped with it.
I talked about it with people. It's like it was basically my first big exposure. And then by extension, a lot of my friends' first direct exposure to an openly trans person. And so I would just talk with some of my friends about like, today this happened, or today someone treated her like this. Like, why is that? It wasn't really like a discussion. It wasn't a super like insightful discussion, but it was more just talking about it normally and get it kind of out there. And then after a while, it just became, oh, I'm going to get coffee with Cece. And they're like, okay, whatever. I guess I just normalized it for myself with friends and people close to me.
For kids whose parents might be going through something similar to what Cece went through, Gideon offered these words of advice.
It's not something to worry about in that, like, you shouldn't be ashamed of it. Even if at first it's kind of embarrassing to go to your friends and be like, hey guys, my dad's a mom now. They're trans. And it seems embarrassing on paper, but it's really like, if they're really your friends, it's not as bad as you think. And I think it's really useful to have people that are outside your family to talk with, people that aren't necessarily detached, but less kind of biased than your family. If you have good friends, you should be fine. They'll support you and they'll correct you when they think you're being weird about it or too stressed about it. And they'll also push you to when you miss things and you don't notice things.
I started out the episode focusing mostly on the fact that there are many anti-trans bills right now targeting children. But I wanted to take a moment to acknowledge people like Cece who transition later in life, and especially people who have not yet transitioned but are still struggling with that gender dysphoria. I asked Gideon what advice he would have for parents who are terrified of telling their kids that they're trans and potentially changing their lives forever. And not only are kids more resilient and wise than we might think, but turns out they're also more empathetic than we might think. Here's what Gideon had to say. I told you this was going to be wholesome.
Well, okay. I'm speaking from my experience and the people around me. A lot of us care a lot more about our close family than you'll realize or you will come to see. It would help to keep that in mind that like, even though your kid is like holed up in the room all day or whatever, they only come, they eat dinner, they see you when they get home or whatever, and that's it. They do still care about you because you still are their parents. Nothing can really change that, and nothing really should change that to an extent.
And there you have it. At the end of the day, your kids just want you to be happy. To close out the interview, I asked Cece how she felt about herself now after her social transition, after her surgery. How do you feel now about yourself? When you look in the mirror, are you happy? Do you like her?
Yeah, I love her. I had a friend one time, and I was like, oh, I like look in the mirror, and I like there's all these things that I don't like, and she said, yeah, but what do you like? when you look in the mirror. And I was like, oh, well, I like my hair and I like my lips and I like my cheeks and my nose is okay. Like, pretty, it's normal for Asian. I don't know. I like my eyes and I like my boobs, even though they're small, and I like my curves. And she was like, so what you're saying is you like almost everything about your body. And I was just, that really struck me that we spend so much time looking for the things that we don't like that we can forget to look for the beautiful things. And so, yeah, I look in the mirror and sometimes I notice things that are like, I don't love that. But then, do this little switch and be like, but I love all of these other things and I feel at home in my body.
Something that you've waited a long time to feel.
A really long time.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for coming back on the show.
Thank you so much for having me back. It's been a few years since the the other episode and it feels like a lot has changed, but I really appreciate the opportunity to create representation. I think it's hard to be what you can't see, and it's hard to care about what you don't know. And so, thank you for the opportunity for people to get to know.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of the Nuances podcast. It was so nice to have this wholesome representation of a trans person and a family with trans people, something that we don't see nearly enough of, especially in the Asian American or Asian Canadian community. If you learned anything or if this moved you somehow, I hope that you will consider sharing it with friends and family and judgmental uncles. If you would like to go the extra mile and help support the podcast, a review is a free way to help. Write a review on anywhere you're listening to podcasts right now, or you can go to nuancespod.com/support for other ways that you can help. Quick reminder that I am currently working on a limited series about quote-unquote queerness in pre-modern Asia, and we're going to explore how non-cis hetero love existed in pre-modern China, Japan, and a few other places, and how our ancestors really understood sexuality and gender differently from our current framework that is a Western framework today. If that sounds like something you'd be interested in checking out, be sure to follow this podcast wherever you get your podcast.